Hi, Yassine.
So hello everyone, a very official welcome now to this today's SIETAR Austria webinar with Dr. Stacey Fitzsimmons. It is a huge pleasure, Stacey, that you are with us today and that you agreed on holding a webinar for SIETAR Austria and ISCCM. Thank you very much again.
Oh, my pleasure.
Most of you probably, those who are in research, in diversity or bicultural research, definitely know Stacey Fitzsimmons. It was my pleasure to meet Stacey this year at the Academy of International Business at the Women Networking event in the evening. And so the idea popped up that it would be really fantastic that Stacey shares her interesting research with us. Stacey is an assistant professor of management in the Harvard College of Business in the University of Victoria, sorry. She received
the Gustafson School of Business.
Sorry, the Christopher School of Business, I'm very sorry. She received her PhD in international business from Simon Fraser University, and mentioned her research focuses on how bicultural and multicultural employees contribute to their organizations, and has been published in several journals such as the Academy of Management Review, Organizational Dynamics, and Organization Studies. And probably as you're going to be on your research semester now on, you will be adding there a lot of more publications and journals.
Hopefully.
Yeah, fingers crossed for that. Well, you probably have seen that there is a chat window, a chat box that you can use for questions. So we are going to actively ask you to give us your questions, to ask Stacey about specific aspects of her presentation, and we're going to have always like Q&A sessions within the presentation. So very welcome to Stacey, and thank you very much for sharing your research results and your experience with us.
Well, thank you so much. It really is a pleasure to be here. As you'll get a sense during this presentation, I care deeply about the role of bicultural employees in the workplace, but simply doing research and publishing in academic journals doesn't do a lick of good unless we communicate with people who are really out there in organizations. So from what I understand, a lot of you work with companies, work with people in organizations, and I'm really, really happy to have you here to be able to share some of the results of my research. Let's see. So I've called, as you see, the title of today's presentation is Bicultural Employees, Your Organization's Secret Resource. And I've called it this because bicultural employees are both plentiful in the workplace, valuable, but also right now not really recognized as a human resource for organizations. So the point of today is going to be to demonstrate both the size of this demographic and also its importance and value in organizations. As I said, as Barbara had already mentioned, please feel free to use the chat throughout, talk to each other during the presentation. I probably won't be answering questions directly because it's hard to read and answer questions at the same time, but we'll have time to get to those at the end, and Barbara will be monitoring that. Thanks. The agenda for today is we're going to be going through these 4 questions. So by the end of this 1-hour webinar, you should be able to answer these 4 questions. We're going to be looking at the size of the demographic, who is a bicultural. Then the meat is really going to be that second question, looking at what is the impact of bicultural employees on organizations, and what are the boundaries or limits of that impact. Then we're going to be looking at barriers, and I have a big data project that I'm going to share with you there. And finally, I'm going to be talking about what can managers do and what can you do as people who are working with managers or with employees in organizations to try to make more use of bicultural employees in the workplace. Great. I love to see that some of you are sharing your cultures in the chat box. We're going to be talking about that more in just a few minutes. So to start, we're going to start with talking about the size of the demographic. Anytime you're talking about biculturals, you have to start by talking about migration, because this is really where biculturals come from. It is possible to become bicultural through other means, such as marrying into a culture, but by and large, the majority of people who are bicultural, it's because either they immigrated or their parents immigrated. So when you look at the size of migration statistics, it's pretty staggering. In 2015, there were 244 million migrants in the world. And if you look at population of countries, that would make that the 5th largest country in the world. So this is a huge number of people are migrating from one country to another each year. And then more interestingly, if you look at the population of each country, and what are the percentage of the population that's either first or second generation immigrant. So a second generation immigrant means that they are the children of immigrants, at least one or both parents were immigrants. In Canada, I'm in Canada and I grew up here in Canada. Right now, about 39% of our population is either first or second generation immigrants. So it's a huge portion of our population. By comparison, the United States is slightly behind. They're expected to get to 37% of their population being first or second generation by 2050, so coming up in the future. And in Austria, I had our Austrian PhD student read some reports from Statistics Austria yesterday to get the Austrian comparison. And right now, as of last year in Austria, 20.4% of the population is either first or second generation immigrant. The largest majority of that is German. The next biggest groups are Turkish and then Serbian. So this is kind of the demographics in Austria right now. So no matter what country you're from, and this map shows a vague estimation about which countries are more or less ethnically diverse, may or may not be due to migration. And you can see Austria is somewhere in the middle there, slightly pinkish. So it's not one of the most diverse countries. But even there, 20.4% of the population being first or second generation biculturals. The reason this is important is because this is not a small demographic group. We're talking about a resource that already exists in our organizations. Being a huge portion of the population, it's also a huge portion of the workforce. And it's one that we need to pay more attention to. So when you're looking at who is a bicultural, it's not just anyone who's migrated. Because there's a few criteria you have to hit to be considered bicultural. And this is the definition that seems to be most standard in the literature right now. There's 3 parts to it that are all really important. The first one is identity. And this is important because it allows people to decide for themselves who they are. As soon as people hear that I do this kind of research, they often want me to tell them whether they are not bicultural. And that's really inappropriate because so much of it is due to things like identity, who we see ourselves as being, and that's something very personal. So we can ask leading questions and help people discover whether they are themselves bicultural. And I can see in the chat that some of you have many cultures: German, Austrian, Czech, Hungarian, Italian, French, Swiss, Slovak, for Laurent, impressive. But what's really important is how do you identify yourself, right? How do you see yourself? And that's the first criteria. The second one is that identity is not enough, and you have to have internalized a culture. And those of us, I think everyone in the room here does some sort of cultural diversity training or involved in cross-cultural management research. So we know that when you have a culture, what we really mean is that you have internalized the values, the norms, the assumptions, sometimes the behaviors of a culture, and it's part of who you are. Not only that you understand someone else's culture through study or observations, but it's become who you are, and you can see the world through that cultural frame. And someone who's bicultural really needs to be able to do that with more than one culture. The last part is more than one culture. Previously in the research, a lot of people were talking about 2 or more cultures, and we've actually lowered the bar a little bit to say more than one. And that allows people who have one primary culture, but a little bit of another one, to also be considered bicultural, because they also have valuable skills to offer. Someone who is, for example, primarily Chinese, but a little bit Canadian, or primarily Canadian, but a little bit Chinese, that person can also be considered bicultural along the spectrum. And that is where I'm going to turn to those of you, especially those of you who haven't answered yet. I would love to know who we have in the room. Right? So how do you identify yourselves? How do you see yourselves culturally? Which cultures do you think that you've internalized and have become part of who you are? I'll be talking through a few more slides, and then I'll be asking Barbara to report out who we have in the room. For comparison purposes, I am actually monocultural. So I was born and raised in Canada, 2 Canadian parents. And I've lived most of my life here in Canada. So I do this research because I really think it's fascinating, and I think it's really important, especially to understand people who have skills that I didn't develop as a child because of my own upbringing. Now, anytime you're looking at biculturals. It's helpful to do more than just dividing the world into two groups, right? It's helpful to do more than say, okay, these people are monocultural and these people are bicultural. We know that that isn't the way the world works, that everything's along a dimension. And this is the dimension that I use in most of my research. It's identity plurality. It refers simply to the number of cultures that somebody has. You can see on the far left side of the scale, it's someone who has one culture, that's someone who's monocultural. On the other side of the scale, someone who has 3 or more cultures. That's someone who's multicultural. You can use the word multicultural and bicultural pretty well interchangeably. Multicultural is more accurate, but people find it more confusing because most people use the word multicultural to refer to society and not individuals. So I often use the word bicultural when I'm talking to managers or employees. Now, one of the first projects that I did was a pilot study where I interviewed people and asked them the same question that I just asked you. How do you identify yourselves? How do you see yourselves culturally? And I used that to see whether this dimension seemed to make sense to people, whether people understand themselves along this way. I'm going to have, in the next 3 slides, I'm going to show you 3 quotations from people at different points along this dimension, so you can see how people make sense of their own cultural identities. So I'm not going to read them aloud, but this is someone at the low end of identity plurality. So you can see that this person has one primary cultural identity, more Slovak. She spent most of her life there and then immigrated to Canada, but she'd been in Canada for long enough that she did see herself as Canadian to some extent, just less than her Slovak identity. The next person is more equal with 2 cultures. And he spoke really nicely about how to benefit from having 2 cultures, to leveraging one side for the other. And the next one is one of my favorite interviewees because he quoted a poet, his favorite poet, to help describe his identity. It was beautiful. And if you don't have a chance to read any of these, you'll get access to the slides after. Also, I have all the references and statistics in the comment section of all the slides, so you can find more details if you want. So now it's time to find out, who are we? And I see someone commenting about amazing how culturally diverse our group is.
Yeah, actually that was me. That was me because I was reading through all the comments of the people. So we have people here from Russia, we have people here based in Vienna, but French, British anthropologists, people originally from Hong Kong, another person who funny says that she is morphocultural, morphing with the present environment. We have the one, the Laurent, raised Austrian with Czech, Hungarian, Cambodian family, Swiss, Slovak ancestors. So a really diverse group, Austrian, Irish, someone referring to Canada, which is in generally more bicultural than other countries. Then we have people here, Bosnian roots with Austrian and German way of life and identity. So a very, very diverse group.
This is fantastic. Welcome, everyone. I'm really happy to have you here. And I suspect that some of you are here in part because you're interested, because of your multicultural backgrounds. This is a topic that I hope is of personal relevance, not just academic or training relevance. So I hope that you'll find some interesting things here that are relevant to your own stories. At the end, I'm asking you, I really do love hearing from people who want to share their stories, whether we have time here or if you want to connect with me on email. I would love to talk with some of you more about your own experiences being bicultural or seeing that in the organizations that you work with. All right, so now that we've gone through that first question, we've defined the size of the demographic and we've defined who is bicultural and how do you measure biculturalism. Now it's time for the meat. This is the interesting stuff where we say, what is the impact of bicultural employees on their organizations, and what are the boundaries or limits of that impact? And to do that, I'm going to report some selected outcomes from some of my studies over the past 8 years or so, and conclude at the end with where the impact is and where the impact isn't. The first one was just accepted, so it's coming out in Journal of International Business Studies sometime in the future. It has a DOI, so you can access it now. And this one, what we were really interested in is we wanted to measure what are the outcomes for organizations. The history of research into bicultural employees is coming mostly out of psychology, starting from around 2000. A lot of cross-cultural psychologists started to get interested in measuring outcomes for bicultural employees. And they had some fantastic results, but they're mostly interested in really basic differences in how people think and how people behave, things psychologists care about. What I'm trying to do in my research program is I'm taking that into an organizational setting. As I'm saying, okay, great, we've now discovered some really interesting things, such as they found that bicultural employees have higher levels of creativity when it comes to cultural fusion type tasks. One of my favorite studies had people creating interesting recipes from either ingredients that were all based in one culture or ingredients that were from multiple cultures. And they found that biculturals excelled in their creativity when the ingredients were cross-cultural themselves. There is also studies that have found that biculturals seem to be more resilient to self-evaluations. And the reason there could be that they have another identity that they can turn to. So if there's one identity that's under threat, you have another option. It's possible. That's one explanation for that. So there's a lot of really interesting things. Complex thinking skills show up a lot in this psychological research. And I wanted to take that and say, okay, well, what's the impact of organizations? How can we translate that into outcomes at the team level or at the organizational level? And that's what this study was about. As you can see here, we had 3 different samples, and we measured the similar outcomes across 3 different samples. What I'm going to show you on the next slide is that identity, plurality, dimension, and the outcomes that were consistent across studies. It means that we have some confidence that the outcomes are real, that because they emerged in different samples and different times, that we have some trust that they're going to reoccur in real life. And this is what we found, that the strongest outcomes that relate to multiculturalism, so when people have more cultural identities, they tend to be higher in 2 categories of outcomes, in social outcomes and task outcomes. Social outcomes is anything to do with the social network. This means that people have more diverse social networks in general. And this is not surprising for any of us in the room, but it is really important. And I'll explain how we measured this, because we asked people, this was in the healthcare organization, and we asked them to report out their closest network in the at work. So the people they talk with most often, the people they're closest to at work. And we asked them to report for each of those people what their cultures were. And unsurprisingly, when you look at it in basic terms, people who are multicultural themselves had social networks that were more culturally diverse. But a lot of that effect is driven by people associating with those who are similar to themselves. So someone who is Austrian, for example, and only Austrian, the social network is probably going to be composed of other people who are also Austrian. That's just the way the world works. Whereas someone who is, say, Turkish Austrian, that person is more likely to have a network that's composed of Turks and Austrians and maybe other Turkish Austrians. But we went a step further than that, because we did find that effect, but we were interested even more to see whether people who are multicultural themselves were more likely to have in their social network people outside of their own cultures. So if someone who's, say, Turkish Austrian, would they be more likely to have someone who's Russian in their social network? And that's the effect that we reported in the paper. We found that when people themselves have multiple cultures, they're more likely to branch out even outside of their own cultures to have a social network that's far more diverse than even they themselves are. And in the next study that I'm gonna report is one that dives a bit more deeply into these social outcomes. The task outcomes are anything to do with their ability to perform a task. And here we're really focused on tasks that have something to do with either international or cross-cultural content. So the outcomes that we found were higher where people have more were more multicultural. Things like cultural metacognition. So this is the ability to pick up on cues across cultures. Can I pick up on whether Barbara right now is upset, or whether she's, looking at her watch, and whether she's happy? Can I pick up on those cues across cultures? And then can I adjust my behavior accordingly? And that's cultural metacognition. And it's a difficult skill to have. It's difficult within your own culture, and it's much harder across cultures to pick up on those cues. And indeed, people who are multicultural were much better at doing that across cultures than people who are themselves monocultural. Other outcomes is things like languages. This is unsurprisingly but important. And I think those of you who are in the class, the rest of your class after this seminar is something to do with languages and multiple languages skills of employees. So yes, really important skill that you're more likely to find among bicultural employees. More languages. Adaptability, and specifically we're talking here about adaptability across cultural environments. So if you have a new cultural environment, are you going to be able to adapt to that, or is it going to stress you out too much? And then finally, performance. This one was interesting. This was in the hotel, and we had access to the supervisor ratings of performance from their annual performance appraisals. So this is a performance appraisal that matters. It has real teeth for promotions, for raises for these employees. And we found that the bicultural employees at this hotel had higher performance appraisals from their supervisors than the people who are monocultural. And this is a bit of paradoxical, because I don't usually expect to see a general performance effect. Generally, I expect to see that the outcomes for biculturals are going to be limited to the cultural domain. I'll talk about that a little bit more. Where the skills that biculturals have tend to be constrained to an environment that has something to do with culture international. And here, this was a measure of general performance. So we talked a little bit more with these employees. And it turns out that cross-cultural interactions are a major part of the job for employees at this hotel. It was a tourist hotel. All the employees are called ambassadors, and they're expected to interact pretty deeply with guests at the hotel who are from all over the world, to welcome them to Canada, welcome them to the city, and make sure that they feel comfortable. So the people who were bicultural were more effective at doing these things than people who are monocultural. And that's why we see a general performance effect. I have an asterisk on the slide here because it was a small sample, so I'm still a little skeptical. I don't feel confident in reporting this as a general performance effect that I would expect to see in a different sample. So to summarize that paper, what we see is that when people have more cultural identities, they have more diverse social networks, which helps them with things like a knowledge transfer across silos in an organization. And they also have more cross-cultural skills. We wanted to dive a little bit more deeply into these social network effects, because I think that that's one of the places where bicultural employees are going to be particularly valuable in an organization. And that's where I have this paper, which is, we're still finalizing the data collection on this one, but hopefully it'll be coming out sometime in the next couple of years, we'll see. But I have results to share with you. What we're measuring in this paper is a behavior called cultural brokering. This is the act of facilitating cross-cultural interactions between others. Normally, when we're talking about diversity training or helping people become more effective cross-culturally, we're talking about a me and you kind of effect. So it would be if I was working with Barbara across cultures, if we're more effective at doing that, that's normally what we're talking about when we're talking about cross-cultural skills. This is a little bit different. This would be, say, me going into an organization and noticing that there's a misunderstanding or miscommunication between people that has something to do with culture. And if I step in and try to help them work better together, then I'm doing brokering. So this would be, for example, coming into a team and saying, hey, Juan, I don't think Vlad is trying to insult you. I think that's just the way he talks. Hey, Vlad, I think Juan thinks that you're insulting him. Maybe you could tone it down a little, right? Doing this kind of behavior and helping other people work more effectively is really useful for an organization, because it means you don't have to rely on every single individual having a high level of cross-cultural competence. If you have a lot of these brokers in an organization, you can sprinkle them around where necessary, and they'll help everyone else be more effective across cultures. At least that's the goal. So we wanted to know, Do multicultural individuals broker more often than monocultural individuals? How do they do it? And in what kinds of contexts or what kinds of organizations? Specifically, we were looking at organizations. Are they going to do it more often in organizations that have a lot of diversity or in organizations where there isn't a lot of diversity? 3 studies, because that's the way I roll. And the first one was where we were looking we interviewed people across 3 different cultural groups. We had Chinese Canadians, Indian Americans, and Arab Americans. And we asked them to report all the instances at work where they had brokered in the past, coded all of these situations. We had 142 instances. And as long as a behavior appeared across more than one cultural group, then we could say with some confidence that it was culture general, as opposed to being specific to any one cultural group. And we ended up with these 5 categories of behaviors and how people broker. I'll give you an example. One of our participants, she was fantastic. She was an Arab American who worked for an Arab media station. And her job was to sell advertising space to American companies who wanted to then advertise to the Arab viewing population of this media station. And so she was constantly going back and forth between her own 2 cultures. She was Arab American. And she would do things like she would have to teach the Americans about Arab culture, what would work, what wouldn't. She would maybe interpret, say one of her American clients came and said, you know, I was talking to one of these people and they wouldn't look me in the eye, and I think that means she doesn't respect me, right? And so she would have to interpret behavior and explain it to someone else. Sometimes they would have new employees at her organization who were kind of first-generation Arab immigrants and didn't have a lot of experience with American culture, and so she would do things like mentor and befriend and help someone new learn the culture, learn the American culture. And these are all examples of brokering behaviors, things that she did that were really valuable for her organization, but usually fly under the radar and aren't assessed in things like human resource performance appraisals. So then once we had a list of behaviors, we developed a scale to measure them, and then we ran 2 different tests where we wanted to know, do biculturals do these brokering behaviors more than monoculturals? And in what kinds of environments is the difference bigger or smaller? The first one was an experiment. It was a quasi-experiment where we had a scenario. The scenario, we asked participants to imagine that they were a doctor in a hospital, and they were instructed that they had to work very, very closely with all the other employees at this hospital in order to get their work done. They saw 3 different versions of this hospital scenario that varied in terms of cultural diversity. On the low end, they were told that this hospital had very little cultural diversity. A little bit, so there was something to broker, but there wasn't a lot there. At the high end, they were told that this hospital is highly culturally diverse, with people from all over the world working there. And then in the middle was a unique scenario that came out of our interviews, and it's this dual culture scenario. So the example I just shared about the Arab American woman who worked for an Arab media station selling advertising to Americans. She was working really in a dual cultural environment. And we heard this from other interviewees as well, where they worked for an environment that matched their own cultures, right? We talked to Chinese Canadians who worked for Chinese Canadian firms. And this was something new to us. We hadn't expected to see, so we decided to include it in the test to see whether that would have an effect. People saw in the dual cultural environment, the cultures they saw were matched their own. So if someone said that they were Mexican-American, the cultures they saw were Mexican and American. They said that the hospital was composed primarily of Mexicans and Americans. And we measured then for 3 effects, and we found significance in all 3. So we found both a linear effect, where in environments with more cultural diversity, you see more brokering. That's unsurprising, but it gives us some confidence. We saw that multicultural individuals do broker more often than monocultural individuals. But here, interestingly, the difference was only significant in the dual culture environment. So in the environment where the organization matched their own cultures, that was where we saw the biggest difference between biculturals and monoculturals. However, this data was done with panel data, where you're paid paying panel participants to fill out your survey. They were all working individuals, and it was hypothetical. So there's a couple things that make it suspect, and we decided to run another study to see whether the same effects would play out when people were reporting about their own organizations and where they actually work. And that's where we ran a study with MBA students. And these MBA students had been previously working full-time just before starting the MBA program. We talked with them just at the beginning of their MBA programs. And this time, instead of proposing hypothetical scenarios where we're telling them to imagine a situation that's either highly diverse or not so diverse, we instead asked them to report the number of cultures at their workplace and approximate percentage of people belonging to each cultural group. We can use that data to then measure this Simpson's measure of diversity that comes from biology. It was normally used to measure the diversity of specimens, but it's actually a great formula. You end up with a number between 0 and 1, where the higher the number, the more likely it is that two randomly selected individuals are going to belong to different cultural groups. So it's actually a really useful formula for measuring diversity of an organization. We used it to measure cultural diversity. This time, there is no dual culture scenario. So along the horizontal axis, you just see how diverse the organization is, and along the vertical axis is how frequently people reported brokering in that organization. And we found some consistent results with the previous study. In particular, we found, again, a significant linear effect where more brokering happens when organizations are more diverse. Not surprising, but good. We found a significant difference between biculturals and monoculturals, where people who are bicultural broker more often or more frequently than people who are monocultural on average. But this time, the difference was largest when the organizations were least diverse. And this was surprising. Later, and actually, if any of you have some ideas about why we might have seen this effect, please include it in the chat box there, because we have some ideas and we've talked with some of our MBA students about why this might have occurred, but our hypotheses are still just that. They're still assumptions or interpretations. So I would love to hear your ideas about why we might have seen this effect. What we heard when talking with some of these MBA students is that what we're seeing here might be a push effect, where people who work in an organization that is, so for example, one of my participants, he was a Chinese Canadian who worked for a forestry company. Forestry companies tend to be very white, very Canadian, very homogeneous. And it means he stood out as different from everyone else. So anytime one of his colleagues ended up working with a client or a customer or a supplier, somebody who had a different cultural background, inevitably they would turn to him to help explain or interpret, or maybe they would bring him along in the meeting to be more comfortable, whatever it was. He was everyone's resource for anything to do with culture. So it means that in an environment that's largely homogeneous, there isn't a lot of brokering to be done, but any brokering that needs to happen, the colleagues are going to turn to you to do it because you're the one person who's different from everyone else. At least that's what we were hearing from some of our MBA students. If you have any other alternative ideas, I'd love to hear them. So all of this, we've talked about the social outcomes, the task outcomes, things like cultural brokering. This is where we see employees, bicultural employees, making a difference in their organizations. When we're looking at a higher level of what kind of roles this means that bicultural employees might be particularly useful in, I have a publication with two professors from VU, Günther Stahl and Christoph Miska, if any of you know them. And this is my publication that's the most practical, most readable. So if any of you are looking for something that's highly accessible for managers, this is the one that I would recommend. And in it, we propose a few areas where bicultural employees might be particularly valuable. For example, if you're in a situation where you're negotiating an international merger or an acquisition, in a situation like that, those key people have to be extremely skilled at switching between cultural frames. That's an essential part of the job. And having a bicultural person in that position might give that negotiation an edge. because they grow up being able to switch seamlessly between cultural frames, and they have that ability, are more likely to have that ability than a monocultural. And there's, you know, a bunch of other ideas in here. The limits, however, to the contribution. If you notice, everything on here has something to do with either culture or international. And as I said before, with the performance effects, we don't generally expect, and we don't normally find, a general performance effect. So it's not that biculturals are better at everything. They're not better at drawing. They're not better at you know, cooking in general. The effects that we see tend to be limited to the cultural domain or the international domain. And so I caution everyone, especially when you're talking about things like complex thinking skills and creativity. I see some papers try to draw conclusions beyond the data. And so far, we don't really have evidence for that. So now we're moving on to the third question. So remember, I had 4 questions. We looked at the definition, the size of the demographic, the impact and the limits to that impact, and now we're talking about barriers. Because
may I for a second?
Yes, absolutely.
There was one question when you started to talk about the previous slide that someone got a little bit lost. Maybe you could summarize again the previous slide, the most practical implication about international teams.
So this one here?
Exactly.
Okay, yeah, so what I'm talking about here is we were proposing the types of roles where bicultural employees might be particularly valuable. And the specific roles we have up here are fairly hypothetical, but what I want to emphasize is that if you want to get value from bicultural employees' skills, that the position or the role has to have something to do with culture or something to do with international. Otherwise, I mean, those employees might have hopefully have other relevant skills, and so placing them into other positions is perfectly fine. But if your organization is, for example, trying to get better at working across cultures, if you found that you have a lot of cultural silos in your organization, then you might want to think carefully about placing bicultural individuals into key teams where they can help other people work more effectively across cultures. So that's the point of this slide.
May I ask a question? So if we think about the organizational context, probably most of the recruitings or recruiters mainly focus on technical skills. So what you're suggesting is that if we talk about M&A, if we talk about negotiations, it's not just about the negotiation skills, but also about how about the background of the person. So if it's an international merger, international negotiation, someone with a bicultural background would be more effective than someone with a monocultural background.
Okay, I'm really glad you asked that question, because now you get into some really dicey legality concerns, right? It is inappropriate for a hiring manager to start making assumptions about someone's cultural background and hire on that basis. That's inappropriate. In some countries illegal, as it would be here in Canada. And it's certainly not what I'm advocating for. Instead, I care more deeply about placement positions. So once employees are hired for their tactical skills, which I think is appropriate, then once you have them in your organization, you may find that you get to know their skills a bit better. Research like the research that I'm doing here shows that there may be skills that biculturals have that are going under the radar, that aren't being recognized. Right, so like the example of the forestry company, and what that Chinese Canadian man was contributing to that company was really valuable and useful for the company, but it probably wasn't part of his job. It probably wasn't something that he was being recognized for. And so what I am advocating for is that managers pay attention to those other skills that may not have been part of the hiring decision, which is appropriate, but can be part of placement decisions later on.
Mm-hmm. Sorry, maybe I was asking in the wrong way, but that's exactly what I was suggesting. Excellent.
Okay, and do feel free to stop me if there's other questions that come in, that especially clarification type questions. So moving on to barriers. The story I've been telling up until now has been primarily positive, right? Looking at all the assets, the resources that bicultural employees bring to their organizations. But of course, that's not the only story. And I have a project that's under review right now at Journal of Management. Wish us luck, we'll see. And we had access to some amazing big data, a nationally representative sample from Statistics Canada about Canadian employees, where we were able to test two competing stories about whether bicultural employees are expected to have salaries and promotions that are higher than monoculturals or lower. And we were able to test these two stories against one another. So up until now, I've been telling the resources story. This is where people who are bicultural have skills and abilities, are more likely to have these skills and abilities than monoculturals, and therefore we would expect them to be valued in the workplace. And we would expect to see that in terms of higher salaries or more likely to be promoted. But the competing story, and that story comes primarily out of psychology and cross-cultural management or international management researchers. The competing story is coming from labor economics. And there they look primarily at barriers to access and advancement in organizations. And we know that because the population of bicultural employees is largely people who are first or second generation immigrants, and this is also a population that faces a lot of labor market barriers. They generally don't have as profitable a social network, right? The people that they know may not be at the tops of organizations able to get them good jobs. They may suffer from discrimination, biases in hiring or placement decisions. They may suffer language challenges that mean that they are less likely to achieve top positions in their careers. So there is a lot of labor market barriers that mean labor market economists tend to predict that first and second generation immigrants are going to have lower salaries and are less likely to be promoted compared to monoculturals. So you see here two groups, right? The psychologists and the economists who are predicting really opposing outcomes for the same demographic group. And we were able to test these two stories against one another, see if there's evidence for both, how strong each one is against one another. The data that we used for this is, like I said, from Statistics Canada. They ran a survey for a while called the Workplace Employment Survey. The most recent year that we have of this one has 20,000 employees across 6,000 firms, but more important than the size of the data is the fact that it was collected in order to be a nationally representative sample. It means that we can be fairly confident that the results that we found from this study are representative of what's happening in Canada as a country, right? This is a strong sampling technique. What we did first is we divided up the population of employees into two groups, right? So we very simply divided into monoculturals or multiculturals, and we measured two major outcomes: salaries and likelihood of being promoted. And we found here that so far it looks like the resources story is the one that's winning, because when you divided really simply into just these two groups, multicultural employees had higher salaries and were more likely to be promoted than Canadian monoculturals. And to give you a better estimation about how we define these two groups, let's see, the monoculturals identified only with Canadian culture. They spoke either English or French at home, and they were obviously not an immigrant. And they had to have all three criteria to be put into the monocultural bucket, the bar on the left. And that's the group that we compare everyone else against, the baseline. The other group, the multicultural group, they could have any one of the three criteria. They could either identify with a culture other than Canadian, in addition to Canada sometimes, or only the other one. They spoke a language other than English or French at home, or they were a first-generation immigrant. Right? So any of those three criteria were true, then we put them into a multicultural bucket. And when we compared these two very broad, simple categories, on average, the multicultural group had higher workplace outcomes in terms of salaries and promotions than Canadian monoculturals. So far, it looks like the resources story is winning. However, then we complicated it by looking at the three most common labor market barriers that are examined by labor economists. And we looked at, because labor economists predict that first generation immigrants are going to have worse outcomes than later generations. rather than their descendants. They predict that anyone who has a language challenge at all, including an accent they found, tend to have lower workplace outcomes. And so we operationalized that by people who had spoke a different language at home and work, because as you know, Canada is a dual language country. So some workplaces are French, some workplaces are English. What we really care about is if they're speaking a different language at home than they are at work. And then finally, the region of origin effect, because labor economists have found that those who are originated in developing countries, either they or their parents, had worse outcomes than those who had originated from developed countries. We did test each of these effects individually and found them all to be true, right, in our sample, as expected, right? There's quite a bit of evidence for each one of these effects. But where it gets interesting is when you put them all together. Because we have a big enough sample, we can test all of these, find out which ones are stronger than others and which ones drown out the resources effect of the two big groups. And I'm going to explain what you're seeing here, because this is the main results from that analysis. Along the horizontal bar is Canadian monoculturals. So that's people like me who have one culture and are just Canadian. And this is, what you see here in the bars is the salary data. So anyone with a bar, any group with a bar above the line means that their salaries, and we found consistent result for promotions, so salaries and likelihood of being promoted were more or better than Canadian monoculturals. Any groups with bars below the line, it means that their salaries were lower than Canadian monoculturals and they were promoted less often. And so there's going to be a couple things that you see here. So I've color-coded the three effects at the bottom. And do put in the chat box if you can't read it or if it's too small, and I'll expand it. But on the left side, the 4 bars on the left are first-generation immigrants. The 4 bars on the right are second or later generation immigrants. And I've color-coded each of these. Green means we expected that to be better than Canadian monoculturals. Red is obviously bad, so we expected the outcomes to be worse. The next layer up is whether the individual came from a developed or developing country. And then the top row is whether the person speaks the same language at home and work, or whether they are a native either English or French speaker. I've used the acronym ESL, and English is a second language, even though it could be French or English, just for ease of interpretation. So a couple things that you should notice. The first one, and the one that I noticed right away, is that the traditional immigrant story doesn't seem to play out here. The traditional immigrant story is that the first generation suffers for the sake of their children. The story is that the first generation, they struggle, they try to make it, they have to work really, really hard, and their outcomes are worse, but their children flourish. And that's not the story that we see here. Because as you can see, it's not a difference between the first generation and the second generation that is the major effect of what we see. Instead, what you see is that either one of the other two barriers, if it's present, then outcomes were worse for multiculturals than for Canadian monoculturals. So either if someone spoke a different language at home or work, then their outcomes were worse, regardless of anything else happening. Or if they had originated from a developing country, even into the second generation. And that's where it gets really troubling, frankly, because we would expect those results to have gone away by the second generation, and they're not. So any questions about this? Because I know it's a bit murky to understand.
May I just pick up a question here? That is, if someone is wondering if this has to do with a person's societal status or really only with his or her skills. Did you test that in any way?
So we controlled for everything you could control for here. I mean, so we controlled for socioeconomic status, controlled for education, for, let's see, parental status, how long they'd been in the country, for organization effects and individual effects. We had around 20-ish different control variables in total. And I see someone else asking, I'm mainly focused on national cultures, which is true. And I think that regional cultures are also really important. The data tends to be a little bit more accessible for national. So that's really the real reason for this.
Maybe the question there would also be regarding gender or age.
Yeah, so in this one we control for both. I'm trying to remember if we found an effect for either one, and I don't remember that. One thing that's interesting to note, however, especially for the second generation immigrants, is we're looking at their parents would have immigrated a long time ago. So it may be that those from, say, China, right, in Canada's history, Chinese immigrants from kind of probably the parents of current working age population might have come over. We had a lot of laborers come over to help finish the railway to open up Canada. And they would have been a very different socioeconomic status from Chinese immigrants today. So these effects may change into the future, but at least for now, this is the effect that we see. Something else that's important to note is we ran the study again. Instead of developing versus developed country, ran it by whether someone was a visible minority or not. Exact same results. We couldn't include both of those variables because they were so tightly correlated that they're practically overlapping. But when you're looking at the developing versus developed, you can also think of it in terms of whether someone is a visible minority or not. And so we are really seeing a discrimination effect here. And what's nice about this data is because we actually have salary information about all these individuals. And so we can calculate the size of each of these effects. And what you see here is on the far left is a monocultural person. And this is 3 fictitious individuals who are the same on every characteristic. They're all females, I think 36 or around in their 30s. I can't remember what age exactly. 36.9 years old, there you go. They all work for the same, same type of organization, same type of education. Everything is exactly the same. The only difference is whether they're immigrant status or their multicultural status. So the one person is a monocultural person, that would be the baseline. If you look at someone who has all the advantages of being a multicultural on the far right side, without any of the barriers. So this is someone who is from a developed country, speaks the same language at home and work, and they're second generation. So this would be, say, an Austrian the children of an Austrian immigrant who now speaks English at home and work. And they get a wage premium on an annual salary basis of about $685 a year. So it's, small, but big enough by labor market standards. However, it gets really crazy when you start looking at the other side. So this is someone who has all 3 barriers to access and advancement in the labor market. They are a first-generation immigrant from a developing country, and they speak a different language at home and work. And that person who has all the same characteristics gets a salary deficit of $7,100 a year. And this is a massive effect by labor economic standards. My colleague on this one is an economist, and she says you just don't see effects that size. So we're talking about a huge deficit, a huge barrier to access and advancement in the workplace. So
maybe may I interrupt you shortly, Stacey? Do you see any relation between a group prestige, like prejudice, and income in your study? From experience, one attendee is picking that up, that she would anticipate such an impact.
Yeah, I think that could be another explanation for the developed versus developing country. So to explain the data a bit more here, we could cleanly separate out, when we're looking at developed country, what we're really looking at is immigrants from Europe, actually. Because we could cleanly separate out that continent, and we could cleanly separate out Asia, which was our developing country region of origin. We couldn't cleanly separate out those from South America or Africa. And you are seeing either a discrimination effect based on visible minority or based on prestige, right? The Austrians immigrating to Canada have a certain prestige status that someone immigrating from India or China wouldn't necessarily get. So yeah, status and prestige will have something to do with this. Mm-hmm. Yeah, good question.
May I follow up with another short question? There is one comment that it might be also an unconscious bias. Mm-hmm. The question is, another person is asking, what does it mean if you're a native speaker, first-generation immigrant from a developed country? Wouldn't that only be very few nationalities, like US, Australia, New Zealand, or France?
So it would be very few nationalities, it's true, but it's all just as German immigrants to Austria is the biggest group, in Canada, our biggest group of immigrants are Americans and Brits. So really what you're seeing there is the first generation who speaks the same language at home and work is probably going to be an immigrant from either from the UK, from the States, from Australia, from another English-speaking country, where they have the advantages of having more than one cultural frame or cultural system, but they don't have the barriers of speaking a different language. Yeah, excellent questions. So here's the outcomes, and I'm not going to go through that because we've already done that in our discussion in the questions. And you are seeing probably an unconscious bias effect. The barriers are very strong here. Coming to the end, going back to these 4 questions, right? So we know now that the size of the demographic is really huge, right? Somewhere between 20 and 40% of the population looking at our 2 countries. And a bicultural person is someone who identifies with and has internalized more than one culture. The impact is going to be largely in the outcomes of social outcomes, doing things like brokering or connecting people across cultural networks to improve things like knowledge flows. The impact boundaries or limitations is that it generally has something to do with culture or international environment and not outside of that domain. The barriers have to do with labor market barriers to access and advancement for first or second generation immigrants, things like discrimination effects, and that these barriers are actually very big and very systemic. And now we come to something that you guys are going to be interested in. So what can we do about this, right? This has been a lot of information, but what's the practical outcomes? And actually, I'm glad that somebody mentioned the idea of the unconscious bias, because I think that that's part of the solution here. For those of you who work with organizations, I want you to, if you take away kind of nothing else from this, I hope that you would take away the idea that focusing on hiring practices alone is really not enough. Because as you saw, right, it's inappropriate to talk about hiring practices or talk about hiring people based on culture or nationality. That doesn't make any sense. But what we can do is we can help managers value the skills that bicultural individuals have a little bit more than they do now to try to reduce some of these systemic barriers to access and advancement. So here's kind of 3 of my top tips for helping managers gain more value from cultural diversity in their organizations. First of all, letting employees self-identify. We don't want to ask managers to start making assumptions about people's cultural backgrounds. And you can do this in a couple ways. So some organizations have skill databases where people can report their own languages. They might be able to report which countries or cultures they're familiar with. So if your company is expanding to Poland, you can go through your employee database and find out who has expertise in Poland. Right? These are the types of things that you can do without having to make assumptions about somebody else's background or culture. There may be some people who are bicultural, but who are uncomfortable sharing that in the workplace, and that's okay. Doing things like cognitive bias training to reduce biases in hiring or placement decisions and promotions. Right? We know that this is a problem, and the size of the problem is pretty large. And we can also do that by sharing some of these results about the skills people have that are really valuable that managers might not recognize right now. And then finally, if you actually want to get value from bicultural employees, you have to place them in positions where those skills are going to be useful. So placing in positions that have nothing to do with culture, nothing to do with international, may be perfectly great because they have other skills, but it means you're not going to be getting the value from the bicultural skills that are specific to being bicultural. And that is all I have to share. For those of you who are really interested, I had one more study that I didn't have time to share. It's in the slides, Extras for Experts, and it has to do with European football data. We were looking at performance of bicultural managers and whether their teams were more likely to succeed in global competitions. Found it's true, so do feel free to check out the extra slides at the end if you're interested in that sort of data. And I know we're at the end of our time, so we won't have time for really chatting now. but I would love to hear from some of you who have attended today. My email is there, and I'm available.
Thank you very much, Stacey. Well, clapping my hands, putting my hands together.
Thank you.
All of us are doing that. Well, there are already comments coming in. Fantastic. Thank you very much. Thanks a lot. Great. Well, as mentioned at the beginning, we're going to share the slides Stacey was presenting today with all of you. Thanks a lot for your presentation again, from another person. Awesome webinar. Thank you very much. Well, just reading them out as I'm only putting my hands together alone here in the world.
Thank you so much to all of you for being here. I really appreciate the chance to share my research with people who might actually use it in real workplaces. So I really appreciate that.
Thanks a lot, Stacey. Well, maybe I could just ask you a very last question. As you're in Canada, you know that Canada, particularly here in Europe, we were looking at your well, the new minister and everything over there. So all the people we're talking to who are from Canada are talking about the diversity, the open society, the openness people have there. How do you really perceive the understanding of biculturals in organizations already in Canada, comparing it maybe with other experiences you have?
It's a good question. I think that, I mean, frankly, one of the reasons why I've ended up in this line of research, despite being monocultural myself, is in part because of the education system here in Canada. We're trained from a very early age that cultural diversity is what makes our country strong. Multiculturalism is what defines Canada, and we're taught this year after year after year through a public school system. So I think that gives us an advantage. However, we do have another election coming up, and you never know what's going to happen. So we have similar strains to what you're seeing down in the US here in Canada. We'll see. I hope that we can sustain our current value of diversity.
Okay, cool. Well, thanks again very much. A last sentence, as I did not introduce myself at the beginning. Some of you might not know me. So my name is Barbara Covarrubias-Venegas. I'm the president of SIETAR Austria. And well, stay tuned with our events here in Vienna. Those of you who are based in Vienna, we have a SIETAR Austria Culture Talk upcoming in February here in Vienna. It's about international marketing, so a totally different area. We want to show a lot of diversity in our events as well. Thanks a lot for attending. Thanks a lot for all the questions and your participation. And a lot of thanks to you again, Stacey, that you took your time over the ocean to be with us here in the web space. Thanks a lot.
Thanks so much. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you very much. Bye.
Bye.